Born in a small town in Poland named Kraśnik. Kraśnik was in the province of Lublin, like we would have called in Poland województwo lubelskie. Yeah. I was born to a family where we were 8 children at home. I was born in June 1st, 1921 in Kraśnik. We were 4 brothers and 4 sisters. A very good knit family. We enjoyed all the fun in life what children could under those circumstances at that time enjoy. My father's name was Abraham Isaac. My good mother's name was Sarah Bela. And my oldest brother's name was Chaim Yisroel. The younger brother to him was named Sholom. My older sister was Goldie. I came after her, and after me were 2 sisters, Chava and Necha. Then came my brother Joshua, and the youngest sister was named Rosala.
So when the war broke out on September the 1st, 1939, you were 18 years old.
I was 18 years old at that time. And my father made a living from having a little tailor factory. Well, in those days, it was considered a good-sized factory because 4 sewing machines, and in the beginning, I understand he employed 4 people. But as the children grew bigger, my 2 brothers and sister helped out already in that little factory. Not that we had the factory out of our home, it was built in our own home. We lived there, and believe me, not that we were rich, but we had my father made a nice, decent living. There were times that were slack times too, yes. And as usually happens, you had to provide for the times when you didn't have nothing. But somehow we lived in a town where the town had almost everything. In a population of 20,000 people, we were 8,000 Jewish souls. And among those 8,000 people, we had people who were in their trades, like tailors, shoemakers, carpenters, bricklayers, etc. And we had people who had also little shops, all kinds of shops, clothing shops, groceries. And usually all the people lived in the center of the town. All Jewish people were located around the marketplace of that town. And of course, all the farmers used to come to town and buy things from the Jewish shopkeepers, and provided sustenance for all the people. We had our own organizations, and I remember when I was young, I belonged to a Zionist organizations, and I was educated there, and I went to school. And the last summer before the war, I was also entering the yeshiva Chachmei Lublin, in the yeshiva of Lublin.
Yes.
But when the war broke out, shortly before, when we heard the news that things aren't so good, I came back to Kraśnik, and we all lived in Kraśnik, with the exception of my 2 brothers and older sister that were married already and lived not far outside of Kraśnik.
How would you say the life changed immediately after September the 1st, after the outbreak of the war?
It's very hard to give you a vivid description how life changed. Of course it changed, because on September 1st, the war broke out. Right away, day and night, we heard planes circling around the town, and there were a lot of incoming people running away from the west of Poland, as it was next to Germany. and we had a lot of refugees there. But this didn't hold on too long, because I remember on the 8th of September, Krasnik was bombarded. Now, why was it bombed? Because Krasnik was a military town. At that time, it had, how do you say, koshari, kaserne, with barracks.
Army barracks.
An army barracks. And they were stationed at 24th Pulkolanov division, the cavalry. And of course, they didn't bomb the barracks. They bombed where there was the residential section. And I remember that day there were over 120 killed people, women, men, children. And of course, because it was in the Jewish section, of course, the most of them were Jewish people killed. And on the 15th of September, if I'm not mistaken, the German army marched in to Krasnik. There was no Polish army to fight against them. Before they entered, they just sowed terror. Everybody was afraid. And I remember that day, they took out the 2 rabbis from the town. They took out the eldest of the Kultusgemeinde, the Jewish council, and also the mayor of the city. And they demanded that immediately the town should give to the German army 40,000 gulden. 40,000 zlotys at that time was a lot of money. And I remember it took till the daytime. Otherwise, they wanted to shut them all down on the marketplace, in the front of everybody. They kept there a whole day without food, without a drink of water, until finally the town got together and they gave this to the German commandantur, the 40,000 zlotys. After this was terror every day. They had to have real coffee for them. And I remember in my youth, we never used real coffee. What we had is, if you know, chicoria. Yes. That's what we drank. Who could afford to buy real coffee? But they had to provide for them. And right away they organized a Judenrat. In other words, that same Jewish council, the Yiddische Verwaltung, became a Judenrat. And from there on, whatever they wanted, they came to the Judenrat. And then they started to take us to work every day. And of course, I was a young man. I had to go to work. What did we work? We worked in the military barracks. We worked at the German commandantur. We worked in places where the police or army has taken up houses, literally thrown out the Jewish people from their good houses, and they took it over as their quarters. And we had to work, shine their boots, clean their houses, do everything that they didn't want to do it.
So it was like slave labor, right?
Right away, it started like slave labor. The only good thing is that at night I could come back to the house and be with my parents and the rest of my sisters and brothers.
How did it affect your parents? Was your father still running a factory?
No. My father couldn't run the factory. There was no work anymore to be done, because my father's factory worked, made coats and in the spring suits, and he worked for 4 other stores that were located in the marketplace, and they sold them. That is the way he made. But later on, all Jewish shops had to be closed. The German police went around and confiscated all the merchandise that Jewish people had in their stores. In other words, life was disrupted.
Completely disrupted.
Completely disrupted.
How about religious services, Jewish schools?
Religious services we were not allowed. I am glad you asked about this, because I remember we had many small houses of worship in that town. But the main synagogue in the main Beit HaMidrash, which was the house of study. This was a house of study that was not even empty 1 minute in the 24-hour period. People were constantly studying Torah.
Before the war.
Before the war. But after they came in, they confiscated the synagogue and the Beit HaMidrash, the house of study, and they made a stable out of it for horses. They put horses in there. So we couldn't have any, we were forbidden to have open public prayer, but somehow we organized that we had to go into private houses, in the basements of houses, and that is the way we conducted prayers.
In secret.
In secret.
I want to ask you a question about your own feelings and fears at that time. The Second World War broke out 21 years after the First World War ended. Did you at any time anticipate the terror and the fear and the killings and the shootings that were to come about?
No. First of all, I didn't, I was a child, I wasn't even born yet when the Second World War was. But you heard my parents talking about the Second World War, that it was a war. My father had to leave my mother with 2 children at that time and go out and be a soldier in the war, and that he was in Austria. And
Excuse me, that was the First
World War. But we never thought that a Second World War would bring in so much disruption and terror and pain to everybody like this.
I see. Were you with your family for the whole duration of the war, or were you taken out of the city of Krasnik? Did you try to go somewhere? Did you try to hide?
Well, in the very first 3 days when the war broke out, and we heard that they bombed cities around us, I had a brother who lived in Kelchevitze, which was about 25 kilometers north of Krasnik. And we escaped there and we stood in that little village for 3 days. And then we heard that the Poles didn't like Jewish people in there too much. We had to leave that little village. We went back and came home to our own home. But it was at that time hard to get any food to buy. It was just like absolutely everything was shut. And we decided to be at home and see what's going to happen, not thinking that this war could be so terrible, especially for the Jewish people.
Was there a ghetto created in Krasnik?
No, we didn't have a ghetto because there was no need for it. All the Jewish people who lived in Krasnik were sort of located in the center of the city or around the marketplace. And there were non-Jews living among us, but the majority of the non-Jews lived on the outskirts of the city. In other words, Krasnik, the city of Krasnik, was mostly lived by Jewish people in the center of the city.
The work that you were describing, that the German or the Nazi army demanded from the Jewish people or from the Jewish youth, was it just taking care of their houses and shining their shoes, doing the tasks,
No.
everyday tasks?
No, there was much more involved in it. You see, they received the Bahnhof station, or the railroad station, from Krasnik was 4 kilometers away. And they used to get in shipments of coal and grain and all kinds of things, and they needed workers for it. And believe me, I have seen sometimes men of 60, 70 years that had to carry on their shoulders a sack with grain or unload coals. It was very hard labor. And at certain points, people were falling on their face down and they were beaten up. And then I was young, I tried, I could do it, but some others couldn't. They took sick. But there wasn't yet the time where they shot people. It wasn't in the very beginning.
I see. So you stayed in Krasnik for the first few years of the war?
No. In April or in May 1940, I was to report to work in the morning Instead, I was taken away with maybe another 200 young Jewish people, and we were exported to a Zwangsarbeitslager, a concentration camp, a working camp. And we were shipped to Ruda, Pauline. Was a place, a little village near, not far from Chelm, Rejovec, around there, also in the Lublin gubernia.
Yes.
But our work there, we were brought into a camp and to barracks, and for the first time we had to experience the living in a so-called work concentration camp. During the daytime, our type work was that we have to regulate the river. I forgot already what the river was called there, and build embankments, if I'm correct in saying this. And this took us for the whole summer, I remember, until the end of September, right after the high holidays. And somehow I took sick, and I was, after this, the camp liquidated, and they released everybody, and I was still lucky to come home to my own house of my parents and find my parents and my two sisters and brother, and the youngest sister was 3 sisters and my brother.
I see. When was the last time that you were together with your family?
Actually, the last time when I was together with my family was in 1942, in April. You see, to explain this story to you is that I was raised in a very observant, strictly Jewish kosher home. My father, Abraham Isaac, and Baila Sarah, they were good people. They were very observant. All our Jewish holidays were observed to the strictest rule of law. And I remember that the last time I spent with my parents was the Passover or the Pesach holiday in 1942. My last Pesach with my parents was observed during very hard circumstances. I remember that Poland was occupied at that time by the Germans, by the German army, and with grief, with great pain, I remember my mother tried to prepare for that Passover holiday. We were still at home. We didn't have much to eat. But food was very scarce. But what we did is somehow we tried, if I could call it organize or smuggle in some little food as we could. When I went out to work, maybe I could find somewhere something to bring home. It was very hard, but somehow my mother prepared for the Passover holiday. And at that time, my sisters and brother and one sister lived away from Krasnik. And as I mentioned before, my eldest brother was married, and he had 2 little children. And he lived in Kelchowice, as I said before, which was between Krasnik on the way to Lublin. And my other older brother was married to another town. It was called Chodla. And my sister lived in Belzice, which was beyond Lublin on the other side. And she had a little baby son at that time. Now, before Pesach, yet, we have received very bad news. My older brother, Chaim Yisrael, was taken out from his home in the middle of the night, and according to news that we received later, he was taken to Auschwitz and presumably was taken, that they started to build already those, what we didn't know what it meant, but gas chambers. And we were told somehow, it took a little while, we got the news that he was in the camp and later on taken into the gas chamber and destroyed. A little later, we were informed also of our sister, Goldie. My sister refused to part with her little baby on her arms. And this was a great insult to the Gestapo men. So he did her a favor. He shot the baby on her arms, in her arms, and shot her too. When this came back to us, you could imagine what it did, what a disturbing news this was to the entire family. Just, we didn't want to believe in it. And in all the hardship, and in all the struggle, additional sad news kept on arriving daily. Lublin, which was the capital city of our province, we have heard that they were being, the Jewish people were being gathered day after day, taken away in groups to a place where they never came back. And we heard that Jewish houses were burned there. And usually this news came back by the Poles who traveled from Lublin to Krasnik. And then sometimes we thought to ourselves, will it not hit us? Are we the residents, the Jewish residents of Krasnik, are we to survive this ordeal? Is it only going to be for the people in Lublin, for the Jewish people? And of course, with all this, we lived under a tremendous atmosphere. We were afraid of our own shadow. And amidst all those things, my mother managed to bake her own matzot in our oven, even some distributed to her family, to our family and her sisters and brothers, and also to neighbors a little bit. Mm-hmm. It was a time that we didn't have too much, but the sharing was tremendously great. And when I think back of those beautiful times when we could share with each other, we didn't have too much, but that was at a great expense of everyone. And of course, she prepared everything. We sat down at the Seder, at the Passover night, and we tried to conduct the Seder service. As you know, that Passover is not a holiday just to go to the synagogue and pray. It's more or less a holiday for the home. We have closed the doors. We were afraid to chant our chants out loud. The light was dim, because you have to understand that we were under martial law. Jewish people couldn't enter the street from 6 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock in the morning. Whoever was found out in the street as a Jew, he was immediately shot. And remember that also, I forgot to mention, we were given those bent arms with the Mogen David, the Star of David. And if some Jew was found without an armband of the star, with the Star of David, then for not carrying it, he was shot. And for wearing it, they could have very well see whether he's Jewish or not. So we couldn't go out. I remember we conducted the service together with tears in our eyes. Especially my father was a very observant Jew. And when we came to the prayer, when we said, Vehi Sheyomdo, which means that in every generation there is someone who arises and who wants to destroy us. But we have to be always watchful for those things. But my father believed in the greatness of the Almighty. And he said, how could the Almighty do that to us? And of course, we knew that Hitler wanted to destroy our spirit and our morals. But somehow, we didn't have too much there to eat, but we had plenty of maror, bitterness. And we felt that though we're not free people, with the greatest amount of fervor, we prayed to God that next year we should be free. And of course, I'm going to tell you what happened on one date that will stand out in my mind all my life. And that was April the 12th. That was 3 days after Pesach.
After the last Pesach?
After the last Pesach, when I was in the middle of the day, the entire city was encircled with SS, with police, with soldiers, with dogs. And it was, you heard nothing but loud shouting and shooting, crying. You heard the machine guns in the air. And when you look out the windows, you see right away neighbors who you knew were shot and fell in the middle of the street. It was a terrible picture. And they went around with loudspeakers. And in German they said, alle Juden raus, which means all the Jews out of your homes. Take along with you the immediate precious belonging with you. What do you think did we take? My father grabbed his talit, the prayer shawl, and the tefillin, the phylacteries. My mother took her candelabra, the little candelabra, with a few candles in case we come somewhere, because we didn't want to believe that something will happen to us. This meant Aussiedlung. Aussiedlung in German, if I can explain to you, means relocating. And they said through the loudspeakers, alle Juden raus, because you're going to have to be relocated. This is a town of military importance. Therefore, this is an order from the German headquarters. You must come out. And they took us out all to the marketplace. And when they had surrounded us, about 6,000 people, 7,000, I don't know exactly how many it was there. They took us later on. They said, who has a Kennkarte, which means an Ausweiskarte? I had a permit that at that time I worked for the German Kommandantur, or the police, where they had their headquarters. And when I showed them this, they let me out. And I thought that this would be the time where I'll be able to save some of my families. And more I tried to get them out, more I was beaten up and pushed away. And the other people were put 6 in a breast, and they were taken that same day in the afternoon to the railroad station, which was 4 kilometers from Krasnik. During the evening, when they reached that paper, we heard only nothing but machine guns in the air. And I knew at that time that death works overtime. And that same night, the few people that were left in town went along the 4 kilometers, and we collected at that time over 80 bodies that were shot. You know who was shot? People who couldn't walk anymore, sick, children. And we brought all those people on wagons into one room like a morgue. And at that time, I went myself with tears in my eyes and looked at every face. And when I didn't find anybody from my family shot on that route to the Bahnhof station, I thought to myself, well, I'm lucky, because there's still hope. I could tell you only that these people, we buried the next day in a mass grave, only to realize later on that I wished that someone would have been from my family, then I would knew that at least they were buried. Otherwise, later on, I tried to find out what happened to that entire transport because they were loaded into cattle wagons, and that same night were exported from Krasnik to an unknown place. 3 days or 4 days later, we found out from Poles and maybe from those barn conductors that they were taken all to a place called Belzec, which was north of Lublin somewhere, and there was a crematorium built, and the next day they were all disturbed, not to hear from them anymore. I hoped and prayed to God that if I ever live through the war, maybe someone will be alive. Absolutely no one has been left. This date of April the 12th will never disappear from my mind, because as I talk to you, I remember this horrible gathering of the people, the shooting and the shouting. It's just unbelievable what happens. And I could tell you that so-called this last memorable Pesach that I have spent with my parents, the last time that I saw him, not even having a chance to say goodbye to them, will stand out the whole life in my mind.
So out of a very large family, you were the only surviving member?
No, but you see, I was survived with a brother. The brother that was married to Chodlia came back after this Aussiedlung in the middle of summer, and he joined me, and we both were taken to a camp after this. And near the Bahnhof, it was called the Pipepark. And from there, we were exported to a concentration camp called Budzin, which was 6 to 8 kilometers from Krasnik, and it was in adjacent, it had something to do with the army barracks that was situated in Krasnik.
So it was in a way a labor
camp.
Yes.
And that was the rest of 1942 and beginning in 1943, I was in camp with my brother together.
In Budzin?
In Budzin.
Could you describe the conditions in Budzin?
How could a person today describe the conditions in Budzin? There was no sanitary conditions there. We lived on, what do you call bridges?
Bunk beds.
Bunk beds, where if one had to turn over at night, everybody else had to turn over. We slept, at that time we still had straw on the bunk beds, straw. Everyone received a little blanket. We were cold, frozen, hungry. But to realize that those were yet conditions better than I have received later on.
Were there any executions? Were there gas chambers? There selections?
No, in that camp there was no gas chambers. But if there were sick people there, you had to be lucky in everything. They took those people into a so-called lazaret, and they kept them. After 2-3 days, they took him out, put him in a truck, and lowered him away, and later on we heard they took him away to Majdanek, to the gas chamber. And there were executions. For instance, one day there were over 135 people killed, shot, because they detected that some people wanted to escape from the camp. And they caught. There were 6 people, and at that time there was such a tumult that they took out and they shot 130 people. Most of the people that were shot were why they were in the general toilets there. And this brought such a terror into the camp that we were afraid of our own shadow. We weren't sure what the next day would be for us.
You never knew from
No,
sunrise
we never
to
knew,
sunset?
because we had a Lagerführer, an Oberscharführer, Fikes.
Which would be like the chief of
the chief of the commandant. I forgot already the German ranks, but I think it was Oberscharführer. Fikes was his name. This name I'll never forget. This Oberschafire couldn't go to breakfast before he shot a Jew 1 or 2 in the morning.
Himself?
Himself, just like this. Nothing. You didn't know what the next minute could bring. It was just terrible. And do you know what it does to the morale of people? Some people just couldn't go on living, and they fell. When we got out in the morning to an appel, to counting, 6 o'clock in the morning, sometimes 5:30, they counted us, because we were about 3,000 Jews there. And when they counted us, it took quite a while. People couldn't stand anymore. They just fell over. And we used to joke around, move away, make room for the next one, make room for me. It was just terrible to describe it. But if you care to know one time what had happened in that same camp, I would tell you the story.
Please do.
Yeah. Before we sat down for the interview, you asked me that you wanted to know how I became a cantor.
Yes, what a cantor really means.
A cantor is a, how can I explain this? It's like a messenger of the congregation who brings the prayers before the Almighty and brings them on behalf of the congregation. Of course, our prayers are mostly chanted, so the cantor brings those prayers, chants those prayers on behalf of the congregation, and it's like a musical director of the congregation. Now, what made me to become a cantor is that in 1943, must have been February or March, I can't remember exactly the date, I got sick on a typhus. Do you know what typhus is?
Typhoid fever.
Typhoid fever, right. And I must have run a high fever at that time, because my brother, who was with me at the camp, went to work, and I was left with 26, 27 or 28 other people that were sick in that so-called lazaret, little hospital, a room.
Yes.
And in the middle of the day, they took us out, and they took us into a place where there was a big ditch, and they took the first 5, they had to undress, and with machine guns they were shot, and the bodies fall into that ditch. Now you could imagine what had happened. I was in the last row, and I don't know, in the beginning I didn't realize what this is. But later on, when it came to me and I had to start to undress, I just took the courage and told this Oberschafir, I said, Herr Oberschafir, ich bin eine Singe. I am a singer. I could entertain you. Let me live. And I could see like a charm on his mouth. He said, Ja, du bist eine Singer? You could sing? Stockmann, that was the Yiddish Lagerälteste. See you, man. So they put me back my jacket, and they took me away. And that's all I can remember is that at that time, he wanted to say to me whether sing, I should chant something there, and all I had in my mind is to chant the prayer for the dead, the Kemul Rachmem. But as I was taken away, and when my brother heard across he worked in the Henkel work, we worked in Budzin, we made the parts for aeroplanes there. When he came back at night and he heard that all the sick people were shot, and when he came in and he found me, I can't tell you how much we both cried, and I didn't realize I still had fever. But I don't remember to this moment why and where I could take the courage to tell him at a moment like this he should spare my life. But remember that 8 days later he didn't forget it. And there was once a Sunday, he called me out, and he had some colleagues of his there who were Volksdeutschen. They understood Polish. He was also a Volksdeutsch.
Other words, they were people that lived in Poland.
Lived in Poland, and they became watchmen in SS. They joined the SS, and they were camp guards there. So he got some officers, and he wanted to entertain him, and he called out this Stockman, who was the Yiddish Lagerführer, the eldest of the Lager, the camp leader.
The Jewish leader.
The Jewish leader. And he said, find me that young man who I spared alive. So he had to take me out. So when I came out, he said to me, now is your chance to entertain me. Sing something so my officers would be happy. Would you believe that I froze? I couldn't open my mouth. I couldn't sing. I couldn't produce a tune. But I got back my composure. And I said to him, how about if I'll tell you a monologue in Polish? He said, a monologue in Polish? He said, yeah, that's fine. We understand Polish. What is it about? And it was called Pułkowy Niedorajda, which means about a Jewish soldier who is in the Polish army, and he can't speak very well, and he can't understand too much of it. And he said, let me hear it. Would you like to hear? I should demonstrate? Yes. So I said to him, już 12 lat służę w wojsku, ale jeszcze takiej ofery nie widziałem. Raz, dwa, no i co? No i nic. Dlaczego guzik nie zapięty przy mundurze? Bo to moje ubranie. Jak to? Wszystko, co żołnierz nosi, to jest jego. To jak znowu moje, to co panu cholera do tego, czy guzik zapięty, czy nie zapięty? Styl czupsuk to nie wolno bić, dzisiaj wojsko się nie bije. Krzyczysz to jutro, ale bić nie wolno. Now this is a monologue that has a lot of humor in it. And when I got through with it, he was so pleased with it that he called in 2 more officers, and I had to repeat the same monologue. I didn't have to sing anymore. And then, to my luck, 3 days later, this Lagerführer, Oberstabsführer Feig, was changed, and another one came in, and this Stockman, the Yiddish Lagerführer, said to me, don't show yourself up in the front anymore, because we knew that anyone who possessed any qualifications or had some kind of, educational background couldn't go on living for long. They just tried to destroy all the intellectuals and those who knew a little bit something. It seems to me that that was their program, is to destroy the culture before they destroyed the Jewish bodies.
In other words, anybody with any talent, any quality that they would not consider Jewish was to be destroyed.
No, I don't understand whether you mean it that not consider any Jew who had any qualification of being something than the above general men.
That's right.
They didn't like it, they destroyed it. And let me tell you, because of my voice, my life was spared, I decided that I should devote my voice to God. And therefore, after the war, I started to train myself and get training as much as possible, and I assumed a full position as a cantor, and I'm very happy in my profession.
Serving God.
Serving God.
How long did you remain in Budzin?
We remained in Budzin, I think, till the beginning of 1944. Now, I'm not too sure it could have been in the end 1943, because we did not actually have a good account of the dates in there. Because in camp, the conditions were so terrible, we were so hungry. Who cared what date it was? Only thing is that we knew sometimes, because we found an old little German paper somewhere in the camp that the Germans left, that we could guide ourselves. And we knew only because if it's Sunday, we knew that Sunday we worked only 3/4 of a day. All the other days we worked full days.
How many hours?
How many hours? 12 hours. 12 hours. And let me tell you, from Budzin, first we were changed from in Budzin to Häftling clothes, which means those clothes that was given to all the inmates in camp. You remember the striped clothes?
Prison garb.
Prison garb clothes. We were given this. When we got this, they liquidated the Budzinlager, and they were taking us to Wieliczka, near Krakow. They took us at that time, I think, in the end of 1943, if I'm not mistaken, because must have been around November, because the days were small. And we worked in a shaft where it was Salzgruben.
Salt mines.
Salt mines. And they built a factory in there for parts for airplanes. And I remember that November, December, maybe for about 6 months, I didn't see the daylight, because we were taken out 6 o'clock in the morning from the camp, taken into the stalls, they call it, to those shafts, the salt mines inside. And when we got out, it was 6 o'clock at night. And for actually practically 5 to 6 months, we didn't see the daylight. Now, what we were treated in there, it seems to me they needed us in there. So we were treated there with a portion of bread and a little bit soup, not too much to brag about it, and a little bit of black coffee. That was our daily rations. We couldn't live on it, and we didn't die on it. And in 1944, in spring of 1944, we were taken from there to Sudetendeutschland, a place called Flossenburg. This was a camp, what do you call that? From there they divided a transit camp. That's what it was. And from this transit camp, we were in Flossenburg, that was high on the top of the mountains. Always Calgary reminds me of this, where during the night it's very cold, and sometimes during the days it's warm. You remember it was May already in 1944, and we were in that camp. You know, during the day the sun was burning. During the day we froze, and a lot of people died there. But we didn't stay there too long, a few weeks. And then they took us into a transport, and we were going from there, I remember, for a day and night until they brought us in to a concentration camp called Leitmeritz, or Litomojice. That was south of Germany and on the borderline of Czechoslovakia. In that camp, there were already people, not just Jewish people. They had all kinds of nationalities in there. And conditions were horrible there. Should I tell you? There was one pleasure there. If you itched, you could have scratched yourself. We had lice. I remember I wore a shirt there for almost 6 months. Now, how could anyone believe to wear a shirt for 6 months? We weren't properly dressed. There were cold weathers. And, you know, during the summer, that wasn't too bad. But as we came in towards the end of 1945, towards the end of 1944, oh, it was terrible. It was terrible. I already kept on losing weight, but I had still my brother with me. And we tried not to steal, to organize. Some way a few potatoes, some way, and we had somebody who was a welder. If I could organize 5, 6 potatoes, he took 3 and I took 3. And that's the way we tried to help ourselves in 1944 in that camp. But there is one story that stands out in my mind in 1944 in that camp that I'll never forget. Do you remember I told you about the potatoes?
Yes, I do.
Would you like to hear? I should repeat this story again.
I think so. I think it's a very important story.
You know, we were very hungry. And my brother and I worked at a place where we carried tanks of gas to the welders.
Propane?
Like from propane gas.
tanks.
They were very heavy. And it was, but I always worked with my brother together, because if he took the heavier side, he was older than me, stronger, and I took the lighter side. And one time I was so hungry, yes, we carried those tanks into a place. There was, in that camp, was a kitchen for civilian Czech people. And I was told that if someone goes in there, they don't let you in. But they were peeling, they needed people to peel the potatoes. They didn't have yet machines to peel the potatoes. You had to do it by hand, scrub the potatoes. So if one took a pail and brought it out to the garbage pile, he left it because he loaded himself with potatoes. And then the other ones, so once I was lucky and got one of those pails. And as I walk in with a pail, the policeman who stood at the door saw that I am working in there, so he let me in. So I stood a little bit, helped with the potatoes, and in the meanwhile every potato I tried to push in my bosom, and I had little strings around my pants in the side, tried to put in, just to organize, to help myself with the little potatoes. When I finally got a full pail of those potato peels to throw it out, I went out and left the pail for someone else. But as I go away in the direction where my commander was working, someone says to me loud in German, "Come here! Come here!" I look around, it's a German couple. So I go over to him. He says to me, was hast du da? So I have potatoes. From where? Did you stole them? I said, no, I was working in the kitchen, so I took a few potatoes. He said, come with me. He takes me down Bodea. You see, in Europe, they have for winter those cellars where the potatoes shouldn't get frozen in the ground. He took me down, and he said, put them out, the potatoes. So I tried to take them out, and I tried to leave some. And while he puts it, he says, oh, you left some? In the meanwhile, I get beat it up. And then finally I took him out, and he said, what do you have down there? Potatoes. I opened up. I put out everything to a potato. And then he said, you should pardon me the expression, let down your pants, you get 25 lashes, but you have to count them. So I figured, what can I do? I bent down, and he started with the, what do you call a pike?
Whip.
A whip. And he starts to give me one, and believe me, it goes beneath my heart. I can't take it anymore. But I have to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 16, 17, like 7, 18. He says, what? You are already at 18? Start from the beginning. Well, to tell you, to make a long story short, if I didn't receive 100 lashes at that time together, but you know, my body, you should pardon me the expression, my behind, was as black could be. And then he said, that is for you potatoes. And he left me, and I couldn't walk up the stairs hardly, but it was snow outside. And a little bit further away, then I lay down in the snow, and it's like a compress. Look, what could you do? I can't go to a doctor. I can't do anything. I can't put compresses on myself. That snow did it for me a little bit, and I was laying for about a half an hour. And I tried to get up, and honestly, I can't. Then I think to myself, look, I have received so much beatings for the potatoes. And the potatoes I see from a distance are still left in that cellar. And there's no one around. Suppose if I would sneak in and take those potatoes, at least some of them. So at least I will have a few potatoes. I was so hungry. So I look around and I don't see anybody. And I go down slowly. And I pack a few potatoes into my bosom. And I go out slowly, and I look around, I don't see anybody. And I come out from that cellar, and as I walk away about 20 feet, I hear, "Come here!" And I look around, there's another German couple. And he says to me, "What do you have here?" I says, "Potatoes." He says, "What? Kartoffel? Hast du gestohlen?" So I tell him a story that I got those potatoes from the kitchen, from the civil kitchen, and that the other Deutsch German couple has saw me, and he was so nice to me, he just beat me up a little bit and left me to have the potatoes. He says, "Nothing doing, come with me, 25 lashes." And he takes me into another corner. So I says to him, "Herrn Kapo, kann ich Ihnen was fragen?" He says, that means, "Can I ask you something?" He said to me in German, "Hast du überhaupt was zu sagen? Hast du überhaupt was zu fragen?" That means, "Do you have anything to ask? Do you have any right to questions?" And I said to him, I took the courage, I said, wenn einer ist verurteilt zum Tod, hat auch ein Recht, was zu sagen. That means when someone is sentenced to death, he still may have the right to say a few words before. He said, "Ja, mach mal schnell." In other words, say it fast. So I couldn't say fast. Instead to say fast, you should pardon me expression again, I let down my pants. And when he saw my body, he presumably must have been taken by it, to the extent he said, "Only 5 lashes." And the first one lash he gives me over my head, and the blood starts to running down my head. And I don't remember what he did more. How many lashes I got more because I didn't feel. I left the potatoes in there because I had to take them out. And I went out, and from a distance I saw a water pump. You know how they used to pump water in Europe. I went over. It's cold. It's snowing. I am physically broken up. I'm beaten up. I don't know whether I'll get up. I'll be able to get up tomorrow to get up again tomorrow. And I put my head under the cold water, and it goes just, if you want to believe in miracles, I don't know how this cold blood was stopped on me, but because this water, the cold water from the pump did. And I washed my face, and I freshened myself up. And I came into the commando where my brother was there, and I said to him, he said, "Where were you?" And when he had a look at me, he almost fainted. And we started to cry, and he said, "Look, if we are to survive, somehow we'll have to survive what we have. Please don't go, because then you could have almost been killed. And please, it's already the end of 1944. The war cannot go on for long. Please don't do that anything." And when I came when I came back to the barracks that night, he found an old shirt and kept on putting compresses with cold water on me. What do you want to know? The next day, I was afraid to stay home in the barracks to be sick. I went to work. He held me under his arm, and somehow, I don't know, I have survived. And this is a story that I will never forget.
It is the end of 1944, and you are in the camp of Leitmoritz-Litmoschitze, and you mentioned that there were many different nationalities in that camp. Could you tell us a little bit more about them, why they found themselves in the camp?
See, we were transported to this camp, Leitmeritz, from Flossenburg, which I explained before that it was a transit camp. And in Leitmeritz, we found already camp inmates there. But what we found out is that there were all kinds of nationalities, like POWs from Russia. they were German, that maybe some criminals or politicians that didn't agree with the Hitler regime, and there were a lot of people from Yugoslavia, from French. The motive why they were there, we didn't know, but we came in a transport of about 2,000 young Jews into that camp. And somehow our camps, our barracks were different, separated from the others. We didn't mingle with them too much, with the exception that the couples were from other nationalities as they took us out to work. And in that Leitmeritz, we also went to a stall where they had the ammunition there to produce, and we went to work. And as I said, with my brother, were carrying tanks of gas into the so-called welders. They had to weld something. They had always something to do. Somehow we believed that the treatment to Jewish people was different than to the others. We weren't treated as well as the others. And of course, if someone misbehaved or whatever it is, I mean, they took him out, shot him, and there was no way to complain. You just lived there with the hope that someday this will come to an end, we will be liberated. I remember this time in this camp when we looked out and we saw how birds are flying free and we have to be enslaved, not knowing whether there is anyone from the family left alive, what happened to the old home, to the family, to my sisters, to my brothers, to my uncles, to my aunts. Imagine when I described before in April 1942, in one day I have lost almost 105 people from the immediate family circle. And not only that you couldn't have time to think what happened till now, you were worried what will happen to you the next morning, the next hour. So we weren't too well treated in there, not too much food to eat, and that's why I remember that after being in the camp for about 9 months, I have lost a lot of weight, and I couldn't go on. There was no much strength. The only one thing that preserved us is hope.
That soon it would come to an end.
That soon maybe it would come to an end.
So it was the end of 1944, and the war was indeed coming to an end. Were you aware of it? Were you aware of the losses of the Nazi army?
Well, somehow you could have seen that there must have something happened, because some German guards began to talk that, do you think that if the war will come to an end, do you think that you will treat me differently? Do you think that we'll be treated better than you are treated today? And we couldn't quite visualize what's happening. But the month of April, it came true that there's something is really moving, because some people could have listened into radio reports, or they find some newspaper. Even the German papers brought out where the front is and what. That's all. But we couldn't actually, look at those things, because we had our own ways of thinking. We had to survive. For us was a question to survive every day. And every day we survived, we thought that it is a day closer to liberation.
Were you aware in this camp or in any other camp that you had been in of any acts of Jewish resistance?
Well, you see, I didn't mention it before. After the Warsaw Uprising, about 2 months later, they brought a transport into Budzin from Warsaw Jews. And when we got to talk to them, and they told us all about the Warsaw Uprising, and they told us in details, and we asked them how they were saved. Well, they were hidden, and I mean, you couldn't overcome such a mighty army. But they described to us that the Warsaw Jews fought valiantly against them. And they told us about their great heroic acts, that we were listening with great attention to them. And of course, they were also integrated into us, and they began to fight for their daily lives. But we heard the first time in the end of 1943 about the Warsaw Uprising.
There were no acts of resistance in Leitmeritz or in any other camp, or were there?
No. In Leitmeritz, no. But in Budzin, as I mentioned before, there was on 2 occasions where there was an escape attempt made. And somehow it was foiled, and therefore many people were shot, innocent people. At one time, if let's say one escaped from camp, and the next appel he was missing, there were 10 Jews taken out and shot because one escaped.
10 Jews chosen
Yeah.
at random.
And later on we found out that the Jewish commandant and his immediate helpers had prepared always somebody from the sick people to put in, not to save other lives. Now this we thought of, it was, if they would have been caught, they would have been shot too.
So in a way it was an act of passive resistance.
An act of passive resistance. How could you resist? We were so morally disturbed. We didn't have the strength to actually pick up and throw a stone. When you see, they didn't come out with their method of destroying us, that we are going to destroy you. No, they came out with methods of cheating us. First of all, even if they went to the crematoriums, to the gas chambers, how did they do it? They didn't tell them that you're going in to be gassed. They just gave you neatly a towel and a piece of soap and put your shoes in order and your clothes. When you come out the other side, you should find it. To the last minute, only the commandos that worked at the gas chambers, they knew what it is to expect it.
I see. Was Leitmeritz the last camp that you were in?
No, from Leitmeritz, I think in the month of March, we walked for kilometers, for miles. I don't remember how long we walked. We were brought into a concentration camp, Theresienstadt, which is on the Czech side. That was, Theresienstadt was 70 miles south of Prague, the capital city of Czechoslovakia. Now, in Leitmeritz, we found there more human methods, because this was, we understand, used as a model camp. They kept their people, they transported a lot of people there. But we found out that they had a few children there, so that sometimes a commission from the Red Cross, International Red Cross, came in to inspect the camp. So the Germans could show how beautiful they run their camps and what a model camps, and children were even forced, or they were bribed to write piece of papers how much they enjoyed this camp and everything, just for the outside world. But actually, there was no, when we arrived there, we didn't do any labor there. We just were kept. We didn't know, just to clean up the barracks and just, you know, domestic work. We didn't go out from there. But it didn't take too long. We could see that, we heard the rumbling of the planes, and we heard that somewhere not far away a town in Germany was bombarded and was utterly destroyed, and the German soldiers, the guardsmen, started to talk themselves that the war is coming to an end, and we didn't hear, we didn't know anything. And while we were there in the camps, they fed us, but with very little there. And until it came in the beginning of May, where we weren't given anything. We didn't see any Germans. I mean, we had closed around the 6th, 7th, 8th of May, or around those days, we didn't have anybody to feed us. We were just all of a sudden on our own. So we had to go out and actually break the locks of cellars where they had potatoes there, and that's the way we started to live, whatever we were, a few thousand people there. And we were liberated in the Theresienstadt camp. I think it was May the 8th. Now, when I was liberated, I didn't know that there are any Jewish women left. But as I walked out there, I became like a dolmetscher, a translator to the Russian guards, because we were liberated by the Russian soldiers. And how about, it's an interesting story. Prague was not yet taken. And around us, other cities were not taken, but they sent, what do you call, spadochrons? Parachute shooters, and they captured the camp. When we found out later what it was, is that the International Red Cross sent word to the Russian commandos that if they wouldn't get the camp sooner to liberate us, a lot of people will be destroyed, because after we were liberated, we were taken out on the outskirts of Theresienstadt. The Germans have built a big wall on the top of a mountain with a ditch underneath, and we were supposed to be destroyed there by machine guns with radio speakers and music, you know, play music. But somehow the Russians, and I'll tell you, I have still high regards for the Russian commandos, that they managed to capture the camp before anything around us, and that's the way they preserved or saved the lives of about 10,000 inmates.
So you said that you went out of the camp and you were a
translator. I went out of the camp, and surprisingly, I found 2 girls walking there, and they happened to be cousins to my married sister that I told you before, the way they wanted to grab the baby from her arms, and she didn't want to part with it, or they shot her and the baby. And we embraced, they recognized me, and they took me up to one of the sections of barrack, as a matter of fact, in an attic, where there were 12 Jewish women left alive from a transport of 40,000. And over there, they introduced me to my present wife, Pearl, and I found her there. And then later on, with the help of the Russian commandant too, because I was a translator to them from German into Russian, to Polish, so I organized later on, and I went, and I took them all with me. We went back to Poland. My wife is from Lodz. I left her in Lodz, and I went back to the town Krasnik. And when I came back, I thought maybe, you know, after the war, maybe a relative, maybe someone has saved his life, and I will be able to see. When I came back to Krasnik, it was to me like a big cemetery, like a morgue. I couldn't find. I went to see where we lived. The house wasn't there. But I found some quarters from my father's sister that had a house there in the marketplace. And I came in there, and I tried to stay in there, and there were about 200 survivors that came back to this city from a city of 8,000. And why that was lucky, 200 survivors? Because there was another camp established in Krasnik, which saved a few people there too, which was an addition to the Budzin camp. So with this, it was lucky that there were a few, but none of my relatives, none of my immediate family. Then I went back to Lodz, and somehow I must have been attached a little bit to my pearl, and I found it there. And all I said to her is that, you want to know where I was born? Come back and let's see. She didn't find anybody in lodge, and she didn't have anybody. So I said, let's go back to the town where I was born. And we took a train in those days, you know. The trains were packed with people, but somehow we managed, and we got to Krasnik. And a few days later, my brother still was alive, and he said to me, look, there is no parents left. There is no mother or father. Look, if you like each other, how about if you get married? And that's the time to build a new family. And I said, you're right. And imagine on the 1st of September 1945, Pearl and I were married in Krasnik. We invited all people of Jewish people, survivors, and there was one of the rabbis left, and he married us there. And I remember the reason why I married that date is because I had something to do with cantorial profession, and they needed me to conduct the services on the high holidays, and in those days it was more honor to have a cantor who is married.
I see.
So I married there, and I conducted the services for the high holidays. And I remember that the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the second night, when I lived in this little room with my wife, and I stood up to chant the Kiddush, the sanctification of the wine, stones were thrown into the window, because somehow the Poles find out that there some Jewish people came back. And then my wife said, my God, after such a tragedy, such a great catastrophe, we are not still sure with our lives. In other words, we heard that some other people came back and they were killed by the Poles. And I knew where my father gave away to some Poles some of the sewing machines, which I could help myself and get them back, but I was afraid simply to go to them and call for the sewing machines, because I was afraid that they shouldn't destroy me. So we married in Krasnik, and we didn't stay too long, just 2 weeks after the high holidays, and we moved on, and we traveled west with the idea to go to Israel. And we came into a town called Gliwice, which is not far from Częstochowa, from Krakow, from Kielce. And we got some room there, we lived there, and we were waiting to be transported to Israel. At that time, we made an Anschluss. How do you call an Anschluss in English?
It's in German.
In German.
So it's like a Anschluss.
Anschluss is like you made a connection with some people that were so-called bricha from Israel, and they had to smuggle us out from Poland. Remember, this belonged to Poland. Poland was occupied at that time by the Russians. I was of age to go into the army, and I couldn't stay there too long, and I thought myself, my God, after so many years in concentration camp, if I have to get back for another 2 years to the army, my whole youth is lost. And in Gliwice, we contacted some people, and we were smuggled out from that camp, from that town, through the Polish border into Czechoslovakia, and from Czechoslovakia to Austria, and we waited for further transport. But let me tell you a little nice story. How the bricha worked at that time. We were told that not a word in Polish do we have to utter. Only we could speak is Greek, because we went out as like a Greek transport. And all we knew is we go to Saloniki. And if the Polish police will ask us something, say something from the prayer book, say something in Hebrew to them, they'll think it's Greek. So I remember we went over already on the Czechoslovakia side, and it seems to me that in the Russian army, the brigade, the underground work was done, and they had some officers there that were Jews, and they helped. They helped to get out as many Jews from Poland as possible. And I remember I'm sitting in a train, waiting, and a big Russian officer, a captain or whoever it is, walks in, and he says out loud in Russian, "Ребята, куда идешь?" which means, people, where are you going? Where are you going? And he looks at me from all the transport. So I say to him something from the book, "Yekum purkon mine shemayo." He said, "Ya znаю," which means I know. And he finished for me the sentence, "Chine v'chista v'rach machaya." Then I realized that he is one of my brethren, and I didn't say anything, and he had a smile on his lip and a wink on his eye, and he walked away from there. From there we were transported to Czechoslovakia to Bratislava. We stood over there. Someone got tickets for us to go on a train overnight. Oh yes, I forgot, we smuggled. We had to go from Czechoslovakia. We got in some way to Alpen mountains. We walked a whole night. It was raining and snowing. I remember my clothes. The clothes was like glass on us. We walked through that night. It was the most horrible condition. And some people had even children and packages. We didn't have that much. But I hold on to my wife, and my brother was there yet. And we smuggled through that border through the night, and we came into a little tiny town on the Austrian side. We were given tickets out there, and we got into a train, and we came into Vienna by train. In Vienna, they took us to a transit camp, and I think it wasn't, they took over the Rothschild hospital, and we lived in there. And then from there we waited for about a few weeks, and we were transported to Munich, Germany. And in Munich, and my wife said she felt she's pregnant, and we have to go on either sooner or otherwise she's not going to be able to travel. And as it came to our attention, people who went earlier to so-called to Israel, at that time it was called Palestine, people didn't make it. They captured the boat and they sent them back to a new camp. What was it called, Mia, if you recall?
Cyprus.
Cyprus. And in Cyprus, people had to go through a new concentration camps. And the condition my wife was and I, we couldn't undertake this new voyage. But instead, we lived in Germany till 1949, when we were able, through an uncle that I found in Brooklyn, New York, send in papers for us, and we came into the United States. While we were living in Germany, we lived in Amberg Oberpfalz, that's south of Munich, in a little town. And our daughter, Sarah Leah, was born there in 1946. And what a joy this was. And what a pleasure to see that Hitler hasn't destroyed that yet completely, that a new generation is coming out. And imagine, we were about 150 survivors or 200 living in that town of Amberg. And this child of ours was the first child to be born after we were liberated. It was such a joy. I remember we made such a huge party that Saturday. The only one thing is that my wife can't forgive me, because when we came back after the party, I said, well, for the whole amount of money that cost us, believe me, it could have been the same by a boy. She never forgave me for it, and neither my daughter. But as it happens, it's a good thing that it was our daughter, but later on we had 2 sons, and that was our family. Sarah Leah, our first daughter, Abraham Isaac, named after my father. Was the second child, but the first of the two sons, and Philip Kalman. All are married now. We, thank God, have now 7 grandchildren, 6 grandsons, and 1 granddaughter. And imagine, this is Jennifer, whom I haven't seen since last May, and I'm just can't wait until I'll be able to see her again. She's already 2 years. She will be 2 years old in February. And of course, our youngest daughter-in-law is expecting in May. We are looking forward because I think that with all the horrible things that happened to us, there is still something that we have to look to, and we feel an accomplishment in our lives. That something what we have lost is not to be regained, but the new generations came in, and this I'm very happy for.
Could I ask you a few questions about your life? Support and the help and assistance that you've been getting from your brother throughout the war. Could you tell us a little bit more about his fate?
Yes. You see, my brother's name was Sholem, and he was about 9 years older than I am. And he lived through with me all concentration camps. And it's true, he was one of the greatest support for me. But unfortunately, after our daughter Sarah Leah was born, on her first birthday, he still went to the bakery in Hamburg and ordered a cake for her birthday. And on that day, it was on a Sabbath, and it was before our holiday of Shavuot, and I don't recall, I think it was the 25th of May, around that time. I don't know what happened, but I was told that he got into a struggle with a German policeman. He wasn't in uniform, he was a detective. And he started to ask him questions, and he presumably said a few bad words on him, and he got into a struggle with this policeman. And all I knew is that he was put in 5 bullets into his body, and he was shot on May the 25th, 1947. After all the concentration camps we went through. Could anyone imagine what it meant to my young life that after losing everybody, I had to go through another tragedy like this? And we started to investigate what happened. All the policeman said is that he wanted to strangle him. Now, I don't believe in it, but I don't have any witnesses. There was a policeman who shot him. He said that he threw himself upon himself. Therefore, in self-defense, he had to shoot him. And on the other side, my brother was dead. And there was no one to say anything against the policeman. I remember at that time, Auerbach was some kind of cultural minister. He came down to investigate this, and he left, and he said, we don't have it what to go, there's no witnesses. And he said he would look further into it. 2 days later after this, the funeral took place in Hamburg, and if I would tell you that this was one of the largest funerals to attend after the war. There were 20 to 25,000 people attending this funeral. I was so much in agony and in pain, I could hardly see anything. But I remember that this is the only member of my family who I know where the grave is in Hamburg Oberpfalz, and I went back already once to visit the grave, and I hope sometimes next year to go and visit the grave again. And that's what happened to my brother. But, as you know, life is strong, and everybody wants to go on living, and everyone has his own family. I can't forget this great tragedy, but that's what happened to my brother. So now I could tell you that to reinforce my own individual life, it was my own wife, my children. They are the ones that brought me comfort and are still bringing me comfort and pleasure.
Could I ask you a few questions about your life in the United States? You came to Brooklyn, I presume, in 1949.
Yes.
What happened then?
We arrived with, of course, this one daughter, and she was about almost 3 years old at that time. We came by General Taylor's boat. We traveled for 10 days, and we were all so sick on that voyage that I said, who needs the United States? Who needs America? I could have very well lived there. But when we came to the United States, and it was on May the 29th, 1949, and of course I found that I had I called him an uncle, a third cousin to my father, who found out he was very, very interested for us to come. And he knew my father very well and my mother, so he came to pick us up. And that family and my uncle, we went over to live with him for a little while. And my uncle's children, who were married, took us out May the 30th at some kind of a Memorial Day, a holiday in New York. In New York it was very warm, and the first time I went for a picnic. I didn't know what a picnic is, but when they took us out there, you know, being sick the whole time, we regained our appetite. And what do they serve, do you think, on a picnic? They serve hot dogs and all kinds of other things there, and I ate, and I was very happy to see everybody. I didn't know how to speak English. And they had conversations with me, half in Yiddish, in part in Hebrew. And we talked to each other. And then after a while, I must tell you this, because, you know, I came into a new world. And I said to my cousin, Jack, would you kindly show me where is the washroom? And he said, oh, please go inside. So I went inside, and when I came on, I came out, sitting in that beautiful green park, I said, you know, these United States are just the opposite from Europe. In Krasnik, I ate indoors, and I went outside. And here, I eat outdoors and go inside. It's a true story.
Tell me, from New York, did you move to any other city? Because eventually you found yourself in Calgary.
Yes, from New York, I moved to Washington because they needed a cantor there, and I was hired, and I lived in Washington very happily. And for about 7 years, the very first time, I'm sorry, no, for 4 years I lived in Washington, and then something went wrong with my position, and I got myself a new position in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And we moved to Pennsylvania. We had at that time 2 children. And Williamsport is a city of where the Little Leaguers was born. And in that city, we lived for 7 years, where our youngest son, Philip, was born in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And it was beautiful there, and we enjoyed it. But as our daughter got older, and she was about 15 years old, we were afraid to live there, because not to intermingle or to fell in love outside of my faith, of our faith. So we moved away back to Washington. I got back a position in another congregation. And of course, my daughter got married in Washington and gave birth to her first 2 children. And then I changed my positions. A call came in from the seminary that there is a position in Calgary. And when I asked where Calgary is, they told me it's Western Canada. So I figured it could be west of Montreal, or at least west of Toronto. And when I assumed the position for the high holidays to go to Calgary, I traveled with my wife. And when I came to Calgary, I was so warmly embraced and welcomed into the city that they offered me the position in here. And I came in here, and I'm here already for the last 11 years. Very happy. The only one thing is what we miss is our grandchildren. In the beginning, we used to go back 2-3 times over the year to see the children. Now, since the expenses are so, huge, and you can't go from here to Washington City unless you spend $1,200, and that is a little bit too much. So we are combining where I'm going once a year to attend the cantorial convention, and at the convention we managed to spend a week or so with the children in Washington. We are very happy in here, and I'll tell you just one thing. I think the telephone company is very well off with us. The bills are huge.
Tell me, Cantor Lang, we've just been through a description of harrowing experiences that you and your wife underwent between the years of 1939 and 1945. Are you embittered by those experiences?
Well, it's a very hard question to answer. I would say, yes, I have a right to be embittered. No, I don't understand yet this world of ours. When I think back, I say to myself, we live in the 20th century. The most horrible things were committed by the most educated people in the world. You know, the German people. And it was done by the greatest intellectualists, by doctors, by engineers, by professors. And when you think, and you say to yourself, my God, we're not living in the old, in 2,000 years ago, where the lives were primitive. We have lived in an open world. Why did that happen to us? So I'm embittered. And I can't forgive myself why. And I think we have to be on the outlook to watch out that something like this should, God forbid, not to be repeated. Because we lived in an age where actually genocide was committed. And if you think that the world has learned something by it, I don't think so. I think that horrible experiences are still taking place in this world of ours. Somewhere, somehow, some part of Holocaust are still going on. And I think that we have to be on the lookout constantly that, God forbid, history, like something like this, should not repeat itself.
So if you have a message for the present generation or future generations?
I have a message for the present and future generation is, I would like everyone should acquaint himself with the happenings during the Holocaust time. They should acquaint themselves to know that sometimes one crazy man, a maniac, could incite other people to do all those horrible things. I have a message to the future generation that they should remember to read all the books, acquaint themselves with history, so they could be on the lookout to prevent this from happening again. If people don't know, and then don't know what happened, my God, atrocities will go on. And in order to prevent this, we have to be educated. We have to know. Now, I'm looking at it. Why am I going to tell you this story, what happened to me personally? Because I think, who knows, all those Holocaust survivors will slowly have to be removed from this world. If God will let me live as long as possible, who will be to retell the actually story what happened? So therefore, I am trying to relive what happens. And imagine, I'll tell you, under great distress, I'm doing this because I know that if not I and all other survivors, who will do that? Who will be able 25, 30 years from now to retell this story? So therefore, I try to tell people, whomever I speak, that remember, sometimes history repeats itself. Just let's work towards that cause that, God forbid, atrocities should not be repeated.
Cantor Lang, thank you so very, very much for sharing your experiences with us.
I thank you for giving me the opportunity to be able to share. I know that it's hard for me to remind myself about all happenings, what happened during the Second World War. I could sit for days and nights in the picked stories what actually happened to me or what I saw. How can I express and tell people that I have seen such a horrible stories where actually German guards have thrown little children into the brick walls? How could I depict stories how German guards would take out their guns and shot people in cold blood? Just nothing. And I ask myself, didn't they have any feelings? Didn't it bother them? I mean, how could anyone go out and commit such a crimes? Of course, if you talk to them, they said, we had our orders. What do you mean orders? How could anybody from the top echelon give orders like this? So therefore, I still think that if there are any Nazis around, no matter how old they are, and if they are found to commit those crimes, they should be brought to justice. I think that they shouldn't be able to deserve go on living a free life after being in charge and giving orders to commit all those atrocities. I'm strongly for it, that though it has been 40 years already, it's going to be in May 40 years that I was liberated, I still think that we still have a lot of Nazis who have committed those crimes and who are under different papers and have been admitted to all the free world, and they have to be found and brought to justice.